Section 9 of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 4, by Agnes and Elisabeth Strickland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anne Boulay. Anne Boleyn, Chapter 1, Part 1. There is no name in the annals of female royalty over which the enchantments of poetry and romance have cast such bewildering spells as that of Anne Boleyn. Her wit, her beauty, and the striking vicissitudes of her fate, combined with the peculiar mobility of her character, have invested her with an interest not commonly excited by a woman in whom vanity and ambition were the leading traits. Tacitus said of the Empress Poppaea, that with her love was not an affair of the heart, but a matter of diplomacy, and this observation appears no less applicable to Anne Boleyn, affording withal a convincing reason that she never incurred the crimes for which she was brought to the block. Unfortunately for the cause of truth, the eventful tragedy of her life has been so differently recorded by the chroniclers of the two great contending parties, in whose religious and political struggle she was involved, that it is sometimes difficult to maintain the balance faithfully between the contradictory statements of champion and accuser. Prejudice, on the one hand, has converted her faults into virtues, and on the other, transformed even her charms into deformity, and described her as a monster, both in mind and person. It would be well for the memory of the lovely Boleyn, if all the other detractions of her foes could be disproved by evidence as incontrovertible as that which Hans Holbein's faithful pencil has left in vindication of her beauty. Her character has, for the last 3 centuries, occupied a doubtful and therefore a debatable point in history, and philosophic readers will do well, in perusing her memorials, to confine their attention to those characteristics in which both her panegyrists and accusers agree, without allowing their opinions to be biased by the unsupported assertions of either, whether for commendation or blame. The family of Boleyn, Bullen, or as it was anciently spelled, Boulogne, was of French origin, and appears to have been first settled in Norfolk. Thomas of Sale, in Norfolk, is the patriarch of Anne Boleyn's line, was a younger brother of the statesman of the family. He married Anna, the daughter of Sir John Bracton, and bound their eldest son, Geoffrey Boleyn, prentice to a mercer. He was probably a thriving London trader himself, for he died in that city 1411, and was buried in the church of St. Lawrence, Pulteney. Geoffrey became very prosperous, and may certainly be regarded as one of the most distinguished citizens of London. He married Anna, daughter of the Lord of Hoe and Hastings. He was master of the Mercers' Company in 1424, and was sheriff of London during the stormy and difficult times of the Wars of the Roses, and not unfrequently exchanged the mercer's yard for the sword, to preserve the city from the outrages of the rival factions. He was Lord Mayor in the year 1457, and by his wisdom, courage, and unremitting exertions, maintained tranquillity in his jurisdiction during the memorial congress between the hostile partisans of York and Lancaster for the accommodation of their differences. He died in 1471, and left the magnificent sum of £1,000 to the poor householders of London. He established his family on the sure foundation of landed property, purchasing Blickling Hall and Manor in Norfolk from Sir John Falstaff, and the manor and castle of Hever from the Cobhams of Kent. After the death of this good and great citizen, his son, Sir William Boleyn, eschewed the city and became a courtier. He was made Knight of the Bath at Richard III's coronation. The branch whence the lineage of Henry VIII's second queen was derived rose to wealth and station wholly by trade and lucky marriages. Thomas, the father of Anne Boleyn, was first heard of in the reign of Henry VII, as a brave leader against the Cornish insurgents. He was the son of Sir William Boleyn of Blickling, Norfolk, by Margaret, daughter and co-heir of Thomas Butler, last Earl of Ormond, which ancient title was revived in the person of this Sir Thomas Boleyn, who was, by maternal descent, the representative of one of the most illustrious of the Norman noblesse. Sir Thomas Boleyn obtained for his wife the Lady Elisabeth Howard, the daughter of the renowned Earl of Surrey, afterwards Duke of Norfolk, by his first wife, Margaret Tilney. This noble alliance brought Sir Thomas Boleyn into close connection with royalty by the marriage of his wife's brother, the Lord Thomas Howard, with the Lady Anne Plantagenet, sister of Henry VII's queen. He was appointed Knight of the Body at the commencement of Henry VIII's reign, and advanced to many other preferments, as will be seen hereafter. The Lady Boleyn was one of the reigning beauties of the court of Catharine of Aragon, and took a leading part in all the masques and royal pageantry which marked the smiling commencement of the reign of Henry. It was not till long after the grave had closed over Anne Boleyn that the malignant spirit of party attempted to fling an absurd scandal on her memory, by pretending that Anne Boleyn was the offspring of her amours with the king during the absence of Sir Thomas Boleyn on an embassy to France. But, independently of the fact that Sir Thomas Boleyn was not ambassador to France till many years after the birth of all his children, Henry VIII was a boy under the care of his tutors at the period of Anne's birth, even if that event took place in the year 1507, the date given by Camden. Lord Herbert, however, says expressly, that Anne Boleyn was 20 years old when she returned from France in 1521, so that she must have been born about 1501. She was the eldest daughter of Sir Thomas Boleyn and the Lady Elisabeth. Hever Castle in Kent, Rochford Hall in Essex, and Blickling Hall in Norfolk have each been named by historians and topographers as the birthplace of Anne Boleyn. The evidences are strongly in favour of Blickling Hall. The local tradition, that Anne Boleyn was born there, is so general that it pervades all classes in that neighbourhood, even to the peasantry. This is confirmed by Blomefield, the accurate historian of that county, and also by that diligent antiquarian, Sir Henry Spelman, in his Icena, in which we find the following passage. To the left lies Blickling, once the seat of the Boleyns, from whence sprang Thomas Boleyn, Earl of Wiltshire, and Anne Boleyn, the mother of the divine queen Elisabeth. To Blickling was decreed the honour of Anne Boleyn's birth. As Sir Henry Spelman was a Norfolk man, and the contemporary of Queen Elizabeth, we think his testimony, borne out as it is by the opinion of the late noble owner of the domain, is conclusive. No fairer spot than Blickling is to be seen in the county of Norfolk. Those magnificent arcaded avenues of stately oaks and giant chestnut trees, whose majestic vistas stretch across the velvet verdure of the widely extended park, reminding us, as we walk beneath their solemn shades, of green cathedral aisles, were in their meridian glory 340 years ago, when Anne Boleyn first saw the light in the adjacent mansion. The room where she was born was shown, till that portion of the venerable abode of the Boleyns was demolished to make way for modern improvements. Some relics of the ancient edifice have been evidently united to the new building, and the servants were formerly in fear of a domestic spectre, whom they called Old Boleyn. One room called Old Boleyn's study was shut up, on account of the supernatural terrors of the household. There are statues of Anne Boleyn and Queen Elizabeth on the staircase, of wainscot, painted white. I saw them when very young, and was much impressed with the fashion of their robes, which are truly royal in amplitude and length. The headdress of Anne Boleyn's statue is not the coif edged with pearls which bears her name, but is a small bangled hat. The full sleeves are confined to the arm, at regular spaces, with strings of pearls. The first years of Anne Boleyn's life were spent at Blickling, with her sister Mary and her brother George, afterwards the unfortunate Viscount Rochford. Thomas Wyatt, the celebrated poet, was in all probability her playfellow, for his father Sir Henry Wyatt was her father's coadjutor in the government of Norwich Castle, and when the Boleyns removed to Hever Castle in Kent, the Wyatts were still their neighbours, residing at Allington in the same county. The first misfortune that befell Anne was the death of her mother, Lady Boleyn, who died in the year 1512, a puerperal fever. She was interred in the splendid chapel and mausoleum of her own illustrious kindred, the Howards, at Lambeth. Sir Thomas Boleyn married again, at what period of his life we have no record, but it is certain that Anne's stepmother was a Norfolk woman of humble origin, and it has been observed that Queen Elizabeth was connected, in consequence of this second marriage of her grandfather, with numerous families in Norfolk, of a mean station in that county. After the death of Lady Boleyn, Anne resided at Hever Castle, under the superintendence of a French governess, called Simonette, and other instructors, by whom she was very carefully educated, and acquired an early proficiency in music, needlework, and many other accomplishments. While her father was at court or elsewhere, Anne constantly corresponded with him. Her letters are fairly written by her own hand, both in her own language and in French. These acquirements, which were rare indeed among ladies, in the early part of Henry VIII's reign, rendered Anne a desirable suivante to the Princess Mary Tudor, Henry's youngest sister, when she was affianced to Louis XII of France in September 1514. This also makes it certain that Anne was double the age stated by her biographers, for it is neither likely that a child of 7 years old would have acquired the knowledge which Anne possessed at that time, or that an appointment would have been sought, much less obtained, for her in the suite of the departing princess. Certainly both nurse and governess would have been required for a maid of honour under 10 years old. The letter written by Anne to her father in French, on the joyful news that she was to come to court to receive the honour of presentation to Queen Catharine, pretty well decides the point of her age, for it expresses the feelings of a young lady in her teens, on the contemplation of such an event, and not those of a little child. Sir, I find by your letter that you wish me to appear at court in a manner becoming a respectable female, and likewise that the queen will condescend to enter into conversation with me. At this I rejoice, as I do to think that conversing with so sensible and elegant a princess will make me even more desirous of continuing to speak and to write good French, the more as it is by your earnest advice, which, I acquaint you by this present writing, I shall follow to the best of my ability. Sir, I entreat you to excuse me if this letter is badly written. I can assure you that the spelling proceeds entirely from my own head, while the other letters were the work of my hands alone. And Simonette tells me that she has left the letter to be composed by myself, that nobody else may know what I am writing to you. I therefore pray you not to suffer your superior knowledge to conquer the inclination which you say you have to advance me, for it seems to me you are certain, where if you please, you may fulfill your promise. As to myself, rest assured that I shall not look ungratefully upon this fatherly office, as one that might be dispensed with, nor will it tend to diminish the affection you are in quest of, resolved, as I am, to lead as holy a life as you may please to desire of me. Indeed, my love for you is founded on so firm a basis that it can never be impaired. I put an end to this, my lucubration, after having very humbly craved your goodwill and affection. Written at Hever, by your very humble and obedient daughter, Anna de Boulogne. This letter is without date, but is undoubtedly written just before Anne's appointment as maid of honour to the royal bride, of which, from the sentence in which the hiatus occurs, it should seem she had received a hint. It is impossible to believe that such a letter was ever written by an infant of 7 years old, unassisted by her governess. The ideas are those of a young woman acquainted with the world. They could not have emanated from a little child. Anne Boleyn is named in the list of the English retinue of Mary Queen of France as her 4th maid of honour. Her coadjutors in this office were the granddaughters of Elizabeth Woodville, Lady Anne Grey and Elizabeth Grey, sisters to the Marquis of Dorset. They were cousins to King Henry. The other was the youngest daughter of Lord Dacre. The document in which they are named is preserved in the Cottonian Library, and is signed by Louis XII. 4 was the smallest number of maids of honour that could have been appointed for a queen of France, and assuredly a child of 7 years old would scarcely have been included among them, especially at a time when the etiquettes of royal ceremonials were so much more rigidly observed than at present. There can be no doubt that Mademoiselle de Boleyn, as she is called in that catalogue, was of full age to take part in all the pageantry and processions connected with the royal bridal, and to perform the duties pertaining to her office, which could not have been the case had she been under 14 years of age. The fair young Boleyn, as one of the maids of honour to the Princess Mary, had, of course, a place assigned to her near the person of the royal bride, at the grand ceremonial of the espousal of that princess to Louis XII. Of France, which was solemnized August 13th, 1514, in the Church of the Grey Friars, Greenwich, the Duke of Longueville acting as the proxy of his sovereign. In September, Anne attended her new mistress to Dover, who was accompanied by the king and queen and all the court. At Dover they tarried a whole month on account of the tempestuous winds, which did great damage on that coast, causing the wrecks of several gallant ships with awful loss of lives. It was not till the 2nd of October that the weather was sufficiently calm to admit of the embarkation of the royal train. Anne and the rest of the noble attendants of Queen Mary, who were all lodged in Dover Castle, were roused up to accompany their royal mistress to the beach, long before the dawn on the morning of that day. King Henry conducted his best loved sister to the seaside and there kissed her, and committed her to the care of God, the fortune of the sea, and the governance of the French king, her husband. Mary and her retinue embarked at 4 o'clock in the morning. Her young maid of honour, Anne Boleyn, though bidding adieu to her native land, was encouraged by the presence of her father, Sir Thomas Boleyn, her grandfather, the Duke of Norfolk, and her uncle, the Earl of Surrey, who were associated in the honour of delivering the princess to the King of France. Great perils were encountered on the voyage, for a tempestuous hurricane presently rose and scattered the fleet. The ship in which Anne sailed with her royal mistress was separated from the convoy, and was in imminent danger for some hours, when at last she made the harbour of Boulogne. The master drove her aground in the mouth of the haven. Fortunately the boats were in readiness, and the terrified ladies were safely conveyed to the shore. Wet and exhausted as the fair voyages were, they were compelled to rally their spirits the instant they landed, in order to receive, with the best grace their forlorn condition would permit, the compliments of a distinguished company of French princes, prelates, nobles, knights, and gentlemen, who were waiting on the strand to offer their homage to their beautiful young queen. To say nothing of the inconvenience, it must have been mortifying enough to Mary and her ladies to make their first appearance before the gallants of the court of France in the plight of a water goddess and her attendant nereids. Thus was the future queen of England, Anne Boleyn, initiated into some of the pains and penalties of grandeur, to which she served her early apprenticeship in the court of the graceful princess whom she was in after days to call sister. The fair travellers were conducted with solemn pomp to the town of Boulogne, where they obtained needful rest and refreshment, with the liberty of changing their wet garments. Anne proceeded with her royal mistress and the rest of the train by easy journeys, till within 4 miles of Abbeville, when the bride and all her ladies, clad in glittering robes, mounted white palfreys, forming an equestrian procession of 37. Queen Mary's palfrey was trapped with cloth of gold. Her ladies were dressed in crimson velvet, a costume that must have been peculiarly becoming to the sparkling black eyes and warm brunette complexion of the youthful maid of honour. A series of splendid pageants graced the public entrance of Queen Mary and her ladies into Abbeville. On the following Monday, being St. Denis's Day, Anne Boleyn was an assistant at the nuptials of her royal mistress with the King of France, which were solemnized with great pomp in the church of Abbeville. After the mass was done, there was a sumptuous banquet, at which the queen's English ladies were feasted, and received especial marks of respect. But the next day, October 10th, the scene changed, and, to the consternation and sorrow of the young queen, and the lively indignation of her followers, all her attendants, male and female, including her nurse, whom she called her mother Guildford, were dismissed by the king her husband, and ordered to return home. Anne Boleyn and 2 other ladies were the only exceptions to this sweeping sentence. She, therefore, witnessed all the pageants that were given in honour of the royal nuptials, and took a part in the feats. Her skill in the French language was doubtless the reason of her detention, and in this she must have been very serviceable to her royal mistress, who, but for her company, would have been left a forlorn stranger in her own court. It has been stated by a French biographer, from the authority of records of contemporary date, that when Sir Thomas Boleyn returned to England, he placed his daughter, whose education he did not consider complete, in a seminary, probably a convent, in the village of Brie, a few miles from Paris, under the especial care of his friend and kinsman Du Moulin, lord of Brie and Fontenay. Whether Anne remained with her royal mistress till the death of Louis XII. Broke the fetter which had bound the reluctant princess to a joyless home, and left her free to return to England as the happy wife of the man of her heart, or the previous jealousy of the French court against Mary's English attendants extended at last to her young maid of honour, and caused her removal to Brie, cannot be ascertained. It is, however, certain that she did not return to England with Queen Mary, but entered the service of the consort of Francis I., Queen Claude, the daughter of the deceased king, Louis XII. This princess, who was a truly amiable and excellent woman, endeavoured to revive all the moral restraints and correct demeanour of the court of her mother, Anne of Bretagne, so that Anne Boleyn's natural inclination for levity and coquetry received no encouragement under her surveillance. Queen Claude was always surrounded by a number of young ladies, who walked in procession with her to mass, and formed part of her state whenever she appeared in public. In private she directed their labours at the loom, or embroidery frame, and endeavoured, by every means in her power, to give a virtuous and devotional bias to their thoughts and conversations. The society of gentlemen was prohibited to these maidens. How the rules and regulations enacted by this sober-minded queen for discreet demoiselles suited the lively genius of her volatile English maid of honour, we leave our readers to judge, after they have perused the following description, which the Viscount Chateaubriand, one of the courtiers of Francis I., was left of the personal characteristics of the fair Boleyn. She possessed a great talent for poetry, and when she sung, like a second Orpheus, she would have made bears and wolves attentive. She likewise danced the English dances, leaping and jumping with infinite grace and agility. Moreover, she invented many new figures and steps, which are yet known by her name, or by those of the gallant partners with whom she danced them. She was well skilled in all games fashionable at courts. Besides singing like a siren, accompanying herself on the lute, she harped better than King David, and handled cleverly both lute and rebeck. She dressed with marvellous taste, and devised new modes, which were followed by the fairest ladies of the French court, but none wore them with her gracefulness, in which she rivalled Venus. Our modern taste could dispense with her skill on the flute and fiddle, and likewise with her agile leaps and jumps in the dance, but every age varies in its appreciation of accomplishments. Of the poetical talents hinted at by Count de Chateaubriand, nothing has been hitherto mentioned by her English biographers. We shall, however, be able to give some specimens of her verses. Like musical talent, poetical genius is often manifested in persons of the same descent, and Anne Boleyn was cousin german to the first English poet of her day, the celebrated Earl of Surrey, and her brother, George Boleyn, was a lyrist of no little fame in the gallant court of Henry VIII. Several of his poems are published with those of Sir Thomas Wyatt, her lover and faithful friend. The French chroniclers have preserved a description of the costume Anne Boleyn wore at the court of Francis I. She had a bourrelet, or cap of blue velvet, trimmed with points. At the end of each hung a little bell of gold. She wore a vest of blue velvet starred with silver, and a surcoat of watered silk lined with miniver, with large hanging sleeves, which hid her hands from the curiosity of the courtiers. Her little feet were covered with blue velvet brodequins. The insteps were adorned each with a diamond star. On her head she wore a golden coloured aureole of some kind of plaited gauze, and her hair fell in ringlets. This is not the attire in which her portraits are familiar to the English, but it was the dress of her youth. If we may believe Sanders, Blackwood, and indeed many of the French historians, Anne Boleyn did not pass through the ordeal of the gay court of Francis I without scandal. Francis himself had been particularly named in connection with these aspersions, if such they were. But as nothing like fact has been stated in confirmation of such reports, we are bound to believe her innocent of anything beyond levity of manner. Even in the present age, it may be observed that ladies who aimed at becoming the leaders of the beau monde not unfrequently acquire that species of undesirable notoriety which causes them to be regarded as blasé. It is possible that Anne Boleyn might be so considered by the more sedate ladies in the service of Queen Claude. Anne Boleyn is not mentioned as one of the company of the Field of the Cloth of Gold, yet it is almost certain that she was present in the train of her royal mistress, Queen Claude. Her father, her stepmother, her uncle Sir Edward Boleyn and his wife, the heiress of Sir John Tempest, and all her noble kindred of the Howard line, were there, so we may reasonably conclude that she graced that splendid reunion of all that was gay, gallant, and beautiful, in the assembled courts of France and England. Our limits will not permit us to enter into the details of that last gorgeous page in the annals of chivalry. Records of darker hue and deeper interest are before us than those of the royal pageantry in the plain of our dress, where, if Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn looked upon each other, it was not as lovers. His fancy, we can scarcely venture to say his heart, was at that time occupied with her younger sister, Mary Boleyn, and Anne would naturally aim her brilliant glances at the young and noble bachelors among whom she might reasonably expect to find a fitting mate. At what period Anne Boleyn exchanged the service of the good Queen Claude for the more lively household of that royal belle esprit, Margaret, Duchess of Alençon, and afterwards Queen of Navarre, the sister of Francis I, is not exactly known. Her return to England, according to the most authentic accounts, took place in the year 1522. Some historians of modern date have supposed that she remained in France till 1527, but this is decidedly an error, as we shall very soon prove from incontrovertible evidence. Lord Herbert, who gives the first date, assures us that he has examined very carefully many manuscripts and records, both French and English, on this subject, and, as he gives a very favourable view of Anne Boleyn's character, there is no reason why he should have misrepresented a point of some consequence in her life. We give the noble historian's sketch of Anne at this period, transcribed, as he tells us, from the then unpublished manuscripts of George Cavendish, gentleman usher to Cardinal Wolsey. This gentlewoman, being descended on her father's side from one of the heirs of the Earl of Ormond, and on the mother's from the house of Norfolk, was from her childhood of that singular beauty and towardness that her parents took all possible care for her good education. Therefore, besides all the usual branches of virtuous instruction, they gave her teachers in playing on musical instruments, singing and dancing, insomuch that, when she composed her hands to play and her voice to sing, it was joined with that sweetness of countenance that three harmonies concurred. Likewise, when she danced, her rare proportions varied themselves into all the graces that belong either to rest or motion. Briefly, it seems that the most attractive perfections were evident in her. Yet did not our king love her at first sight, nor before she had lived some time in France, whither, in the train of the Queen of France, and in the company of a sister of the Marquis of Dorset, she went A.D. 1514. After the death of Louis XII, she did not return with the dowager, but was received into a place of much honour with the other queen, and then with the Duchess of Alençon, where she stayed till some difference grew betwixt our king and Francis. Therefore, as saith Du Tillet and our records, about the time when our students at Paris were remanded, she likewise left Paris, her parents not thinking fit for her to stay any longer. In confirmation of this statement, Fidesz also informs us that Francis I complained to the English ambassador that the English scholars and the daughter of Sir Thomas Boleyn had returned home. When a disputed matter happens to be linked with a public event, there can be no real difficulty in fixing the date, at least not to those historians who, instead of following the assertions of others, refer to the fountainheads of history. There may be another cause which may be considered a family reason for Anne's return to England in that year. This was the dispute between Sir Thomas Boleyn and the male heirs of the Butlers for the inheritance of the last Earl of Wiltshire, Anne's great-grandfather, which had proceeded to such a height that the Earl of Surrey suggested to the king that the best way of composing their differences would be by a matrimonial alliance between a daughter of Sir Thomas Boleyn and the heir of his opponent, Sir Piers Butler. Henry agreed, and directed Wolsey to bring about the marriage. Mary Boleyn had been married to William Carey 9 months before Wolsey received this interesting commission in November 1521. Therefore Anne was recalled from France, for the purpose of being made the bond of peace between her father and their rival kinsman, Piers the Red. With so many graces of person and manners as were possessed by the lovely Boleyn, it is remarkable that she had not previously disposed of both hand and heart to some noble cavalier in the gay and gallant court of France, but she appears to have been free from every sort of engagement when she returned to England. She was then, Lord Herbert tells us, about 20 years of age, but according to the French historian Rastal, a contemporary, and Lety, who all affirm that she was 15 when she entered the service of Mary Tudor, Queen of France, she must have been 2 years older. The first time Henry saw her after her return to England was in her father's garden at Hever, where it is said he encountered her by accident, and admiring her beauty and graceful demeanour, he entered into conversation with her, when he was so much charmed by her sprightly wit, that on his return to Westminster he told Wolsey that he had been discoursing with a young lady who had the wit of an angel and was worthy of a crown. It is sufficient if your majesty finds her worthy of your love, was the shrewd rejoinder. Henry said that he feared she would never condescend in that way. Great princes, observed Wolsey, if they choose to play the lover, have that in their power which would mollify a heart of steel. Our author avers that Wolsey, having a desire to get all the power of state into his own hands, would have been glad to see the king engrossed in the intoxication of a love affair, and that he was the first person who suggested Anne Boleyn's appointment as maid of honour to the queen. There was at this time presented to the eye of the court, says the poet Wyatt, the rare and admirable beauty of the fresh and young lady Anne Boleyn, to be attending upon the queen. In this noble imp, the graces of nature, adorned by gracious education, seemed even at the first to have promised bliss unto her in after times. She was taken at that time to have a beauty, not so whitely, clear and fresh, but above all we may esteem, which appeared much more excellent by her favour, passing sweet and cheerful, and was enhanced by her noble presence of shape and fashion, representing both mildness and majesty, more than can be expressed. Wyatt is rapturous in his commendations of her musical skill and the exquisite sweetness of her voice, both in singing and in speaking. In the true spirit of a lover, the courtly poet, when he mentions the malformation of the little finger of the left hand, on which there was a double nail, with something like an indication of a sixth finger, says, "But that in which others might have regarded as a defect was to her an occasion of additional grace, by the skilful manner in which she concealed it from observation." On this account Anne always wore the hanging sleeves, previously mentioned by Chateaubriand, as her peculiar fashion when in France. This mode, which was introduced by her into the court of Catharine of Aragon, was eagerly copied by the other ladies. Her taste and skill in dress are mentioned even by Sanders, who tells us, "She was unrivalled in the gracefulness of her attire, and the fertility of her invention in devising new patterns, which were imitated by all the court belles, by whom she was regarded as the glass of fashion." The same author gives us the following description of her person from a contemporary, not quite so enthusiastic in his ideas of her personal charms as her admirer, the poetical Wyatt. Anne Boleyn was in stature rather tall and slender, with an oval face, black hair, and a complexion inclining to sallow. One of her upper teeth projected a little. She appears at times to suffer from asthma. On her left hand a sixth finger might be perceived. On her throat there was a protuberance, which Chateaubriand describes as a disagreeable large mole, resembling a strawberry. This she carefully covered with an ornamented collar band, a fashion which was blindly imitated by the rest of the maids of honour, though they had never before thought of wearing anything of the kind. Her face and figure were in other respects symmetrical, continues Sanders. Beauty and sprightliness sat on her lips. In readiness of repartee, skill in the dance, and in playing on the lute, she was unsurpassed. Having thus placed before our readers the testimony of friend and foe as to the charms and accomplishments of the fair Boleyn, we will proceed to describe the allowance and rules that were observed with regard to the table of the ladies in the household of Queen Catharine, to which Anne was now attached. Each maid of honour was allowed a woman servant and a spaniel as her attendants. The boucher of court afforded ample sustenance not only to the lady herself but her retainers, both biped and quadruped, were their appetites ever so voracious. A chine of beef, a manchet, and a shea loaf offered a plentiful breakfast for the three. To these viands were added a gallon of ale, which could only be discussed by two of the party. The brewer was enjoined to put neither hops nor brimstone into their ale, the first being deemed as horrible an alteration as the last. The maids of honour, like officers in the army and navy at the present day, dined at mess, a circumstance which shows how very ancient that familiar term is. To the honour of the ladies we have nothing to record of their squabbles at mess. 7 messes of ladies dined at the same table in the great chamber. Manchets, beef, mutton, ale, and wine were served to them in abundance, to which were added hens, pigeons, and rabbits. On fast days their mess was supplied with salt salmon, salted eels, whitings, gurney, plaice, and flounders. Such of the ladies as were peers' daughters had stabling allowed them. There was a striking resemblance between Anne Boleyn and her sister Mary, the previous object of Henry's attention. But Mary was the fairest, the most delicately featured, and the most feminine of the two. In Anne, the more powerful charms of genius, wit, and fascination triumphed over every defect which prevented her from being considered a perfect beauty, and rendered her the leading star of the English court. Yet it was her likeness to her sister which perhaps, in the first instance, constituted her chief attraction to the king, who soon became secretly enamoured of her, though he concealed the state of his mind. As for the fair Boleyn herself, at the very time when most surrounded by her admirers, she appears to have been least sensible to the pride of conquest, having engaged herself in a romantic love affair with Henry Lord Percy, the eldest son of the Earl of Northumberland, regardless of the family arrangement by which she was pledged to become the wife of the heir of Sir Piers Butler. Percy, like herself, had been destined, by paternal policy, to a matrimonial engagement wherein affection had no share. He had exhibited great reluctance to fulfil the contract, into which his father had entered for him in his boyhood with the daughter of the Earl of Shrewsbury, and it was still unratified on his part when he appeared at court as an élève of Cardinal Wolsey. The office which Percy filled about the person of the minister required that he should attend him to the palace daily, which he did, and while his patron was closeted with the king or engaged at the council board, he was accustomed to resort to the queen's antechamber, where he passed the time in dalliance with the maids of honour. At last he singled out Mistress Anne as the object of his exclusive attention, and, from their frequent meetings, such love was nourished between them that a promise of marriage was exchanged, and reckless alike of the previous engagements which had been made for them in other quarters by their parents, they became what was then called troth plight, or insured to each other. Percy, like a true lover, gloried in his passion, and made no secret of his engagement, which was at length whispered to the king by some envious busybody, who had probably observed that Henry was not insensible to the charms of Anne Boleyn. The pangs of jealousy occasioned by this intelligence, it is said, first awakened the monarch to the state of his own feelings towards his fair subject, in whose conversation he had always taken the liveliest pleasure, without being himself aware that he regarded her with emotions inconsistent with his duty as a married man. As for the young lady herself, she appears to have been wholly unconscious of the impression she had made on her sovereign's heart. In fact, as her whole thoughts were employed in securing a far more desirous object, namely, her marriage with the heir of the illustrious and wealthy house of Percy, it is scarcely probable that she would incur the risk of alarming her honourable lover by coquetries with the king. Under the circumstances, we think Anne Boleyn must be acquitted of having purposely attracted the attention of Henry in the first instance. On the contrary, she must, at this peculiar crisis, have regarded his passion as the greatest misfortune that could have befallen her, as it was the means of preventing her marriage with the only man whom we have the slightest reason to believe she ever loved. If Anne, however, regarded the king with indifference, his feelings towards her was such that he could not brook the thought of seeing her the wife of another, though aware that it was not in his power to marry her himself. With characteristic selfishness of his nature, he determined to separate the lovers. Accordingly, he sent for Wolsey, and, expressing himself very angrily on the subject of the contract into which Anne Boleyn and Percy had entered, charged him to take prompt steps for dissolving their engagement. It is probable that Henry made the infringement of the arrangement, previously sanctioned by him, for the marriage of Anne with the son of Sir Piers Butler, the pretext for the extraordinary displeasure he manifested on this occasion. The cardinal, in great perplexity, returned to his house at Westminster, and sending for Lord Percy, there before several of his servants, he rudely addressed him in these words: I marvel not a little at thy folly, that thou wouldest attempt to assure, contract thyself, with a foolish girl yonder in the court, and Boleyn. Dost thou not consider the estate that God hath called thee unto into this world? For after thy father's death, thou art likely to inherit and enjoy one of the noblest earldoms in the kingdom, and therefore it had been most meet and convenient for thee to have thy father's consent in this case, and to have acquainted the king's majesty therewith, requiring his princely favour, and in all such matters submitting thy proceedings unto his highness, who would not only thankfully have accepted thy submission, but I am assured would have so provided thy purpose, that he would have advanced thee much more nobly, and have matched thee according to thy degree and honour, and so by thy wise behaviour mightest have grown into his high favour, to thy great advancement. But now, see what you have done through your wilfulness. You have not only offended your father, but also your loving sovereign lord, and matched yourself with such a one as neither the king nor your father will consent to. And hereof I put thee out of doubt that I will send for thy father, who, at his coming, shall either break this unadvised bargain, or else disinherit thee forever. The king's majesty will also complain of thee to thy father, and require no less than I have said, because he intended to prefer Anne Boleyn to another, wherein the king had already travailed, taken trouble, and being almost at a point with one for her, though she knew it not, yet hath the king, like a politic prince, conveyed the matter in such sort that she will be, I doubt not, upon his grace's mention, glad and agreeable to the same. Sir, quoth the Lord Percy weeping, I knew not the king's pleasure, and am sorry for it. I considered I am of good years, and thought myself able to provide me a convenient wife as my fancy should please me, not doubting that my lord and father would have been right well content. Though she be but a simple maid, and a knight to her father, yet is she descended of right noble parentage, for her mother is high of the Norfolk blood, and her father descended of the Earl of Ormond, being one of the earls heir general. Why then, sir, should I be anything scrupulous to match with her, in regarding to her estate and descent equal with mine, when I shall be in most dignity? Therefore I most humbly beseech your grace's favour therein, and also to entreat the king's majesty on my behalf, for his princely favour in this matter, which I cannot forsake. No, sirs, quoth the cardinal to us, ye may see what wisdom is in this wilful boy's head. I thought that, when thou heardest the king's pleasure and attention herein, thou wouldst have relented, and put thyself and thy voluptuous act wholly to the king's will and pleasure, and by him to have been ordered, as his grace should have thought good. Sir, quoth the Lord Percy, so I would, but in this matter I have gone so far before so many worthy witnesses, that I know not how to discharge myself and my conscience. Why, quoth the cardinal, thinkest thou that the king and I know not what we have to do in weighty matters as this? Yes, I warrant thee, but I see no submission in thee to this purpose. Forsooth, my lord, quoth Lord Percy, if it please your grace, I will submit myself wholly to the king and your grace in this matter, my conscience being discharged of a weighty burden thereof. Well then, quoth my lord cardinal, I will send for your father out of the north, and he and we shall take such order as, in the mean season, I charge thee that thou resort no more into her company, as thou wilt abide the king's indignation. With these words he rose up and went into his chamber. Nor was this unceremonious lecture the only mortification of the unfortunate lover was doomed to receive. His father, the Earl of Northumberland, a man in whose cold heart and narrow mind the extremes of pride and meanness meet, came with all speed out of the north, having received a summons in the king's name, and, going first to Wolsey's house to inquire into the matter, was received by that proud statesman in his gallery, where, says Cavendish, they had a long and secret communication. Then, after priming himself for the business with a cup of the cardinal's wine, he seated himself on a bench which stood at the end of the gallery for the use of the serving men, and calling his son to him, he rated him in the following harsh words, while Percy stood cap in hand before him. Son, he quoteth, even as thou hast been, and always wert, a proud, licentious, and unthinking waster, so hast thou now declared thyself. And therefore what joy, what comfort, or pleasure, or solace, shall I conceive of thee, that thus, without discretion, has misused thyself, having neither regard unto me, thy natural father, nor yet to the king, thy sovereign lord, to whom all honest and loyal subjects bear faithful obedience, nor to the weal of thy own estate, but hast unadvisedly assured thyself unto her, for whom the king is with thee highly displeased, whose displeasure is intolerable for any subject to bear. But his grace, considering the lightness of thy head and wilful qualities of thy person, his indignation were able to ruin me and my posterity utterly. Yet he, being my singular good lord and favourable prince, and also my lord cardinal, my good lord, hath and doth clearly excuse me in thy light act, and do lament thy folly, rather than malign me for the same, and hath devised an order to be taken for thee, to whom both I and you are more bound than we conceive of. I pray God that this may be sufficient admonition to thee, to use thyself more wisely hereafter, for assure thyself that, if thou dost not amend thy prodigality, thou wilt be the last earl of our house. For thy natural inclinations, thou art masterful and prodigal, to consume that all thy progenitors have, with great travail, gathered together. But I trust, I assure thee, so to order my succession thou shalt consume thereof but little. Then telling Percy that he did not mean to make him his heir, having other boys whom he trusted would prove themselves wiser men, he threatened to choose the most promising of those for his successor. To crown all, he bade Wolsey's servants to mark his words, and besought them not to be sparing in telling his son of his faults. Then bidding him go his ways to his lord and master, and serve him diligently, he departed to his barge. The matter did not end here, for Percy was banished the court, and not only commanded to avoid Mistress Anne's company, but compelled to fulfil in all haste the hitherto unratified contract, which his father had made for him in his boyhood with Lady Mary Talbot, one of the Earl of Shrewsbury's daughters. The date of the year in which this important episode in the life of Anne Boleyn occurred is stated by Herbert, with great accuracy, to be 1523, which is verified beyond a doubt by a letter from Anne's cousin, the Earl of Surrey, scribbled the 12th day of September, 1523, in which he says, The marriage of my lord Percy shall be with my lord Stewart's, Shrewsbury's daughter, whereof I am glad. The chief baron is with my lord of Northumberland to conclude the marriage." If Percy had possessed sufficient strength of mind to have remained constant to his engagement with the beautiful and beloved Anne Boleyn, he would have been soon at liberty to please himself, for the proud and worldly minded earl, his father, died in less than 3 years after he had rendered him the most wretched of men, by forcing him into a heartless marriage. Percy was married to Lady Mary Talbot at the close of the year 1523, and succeeded to the earldom of Northumberland on the death of his father, 1526-27, which dates afford incontrovertible evidence that Anne Boleyn returned to England, as stated by Fiddes and Herbert, in 1522, and not, as some other historians erroneously affirm, in 1527, when Percy had been married 4 years. End of Section 9.